Edo, 1859, a young teacher walks calmly toward execution, condemned for plotting to kill a shogunate minister. He never learns that the teenagers he taught will soon overthrow that same government. Who was Yoshida Shoin, and how did a dead man build a nation? He trained the men who would overthrow Japan's government. From a one-room schoolhouse under house arrest. At 29, he was beheaded as a traitor. So why does modern Japan call him one of its founding fathers? Yoshida Shoin was born in 1830 in the western domain of Choshu, at the far end of Japan's main island, adopted as a child into a family of military strategists. He was a prodigy of unnerving intensity. By age 9, he was teaching military science to adult samurai, and by 11, he lectured the Lord of Choshu himself on the art of war. Most children who show this kind of brilliance are shaped by their teachers. Shoin was shaped by something else, an unshakable conviction that Japan itself was in danger, and that he alone could see how. By his 20s, Shoin had walked across Japan, chasing knowledge the shogunate tried to keep hidden, studying artillery, coastal defense, and the West under the scholar Sakuma Shozan. Then, in 1853, 4 black American warships under Commodore Perry steamed into Edo Bay, their cannons aimed at a country with no navy capable of answering them. For Shoin, it was proof of everything he feared. Japan was defenseless, and its rulers were pretending otherwise. He became consumed by one idea. If Japan could not yet fight the West, it first had to understand it. When Perry's fleet returned to Japan in 1854, Shoin saw his chance. On a dark night at Shimoda, he and a companion rowed out to the American flagship and begged to be smuggled aboard, determined to see the outside world for himself at any cost, in direct defiance of Japan's law forbidding travel abroad on pain of death. Perry's officers refused him, fearing it would wreck delicate treaty negotiations. Shoin had no ship, no permission, and no way home except one: to turn himself in to the shogunate and confess everything. Shoin surrendered to Japanese authorities and confessed his plan in full, refusing to let his companion take the blame alone. For a would-be traitor who had tried to leave the country illegally, the shogunate showed surprising restraint, imprisonment rather than execution. He was locked in Edo's Denmacho jail, then transferred back to his home domain and confined in Noyama prison in Hagi. Most men would have counted this the end of their story. Shoin, still only 24, was about to discover that a prison cell could become something else entirely: a classroom. Inside Noyama prison, Shoin began lecturing his fellow inmates on history, philosophy, and the crisis facing Japan, turning condemned men into eager students. Released to house arrest in 1855, he kept teaching, and in 1857 took over his uncle's tiny village school, Shoka Sonjuku, in Hagi. It was barely more than a single room. But Shoin taught without hierarchy, treating farmers' sons and samurai heirs as equals, pushing every student to ask not what they knew, but what they were prepared to risk for it. In little more than a year, that one room would reshape a nation.
The students who passed through Shoka Sonjuku read like a roster of the men who would build modern Japan. Takasugi Shinsaku, the reckless tactical genius. Kusaka Genzui, the fiery idealist. Itō Hirobumi and Yamagata Aritomo, then unremarkable teenage sons of low-ranking samurai. Shoin taught for barely more than a year, yet his students later said he changed how they saw their own lives entirely. His core lesson was simple and dangerous. Loyalty to the emperor mattered more than loyalty to the shogunate that had ruled Japan for 250 years. It was an idea that could get a man killed. In 1858, the shogunate's chief minister, Ii Naosuke, signed a trade treaty with the United States without imperial approval, and then crushed anyone who objected. The Ansei Purge swept across Japan. Dissenting daimyo and courtiers were placed under house arrest or forced into retirement, while the scholars and activists who resisted most fiercely were imprisoned or executed. Shoin watched from Choshu with mounting fury, certain that Ii Naosuke's treaty betrayed the emperor and doomed the country to foreign domination. Talk was no longer enough for him. If the shogunate would not defend Japan's honor, Shoin decided, someone would have to force its hand, even if that meant striking at the government itself. Shoin devised a plan few of his own students would support. Intercept and kill Manabe Akikatsu, the shogunate minister who had been sent to Kyoto to carry out Ii Naosuke's purge. When his students and even his own family refused to help, Shoin did something almost incomprehensible. He wrote directly to the Choshu domain government, laying out the assassination plot in detail and asking for weapons to carry it out. He was not hiding his intentions. He was daring the authorities to stop him, or to finally act as he believed they should.
The domain government did not arm him. It arrested him. Shoin was sent back to Edo in chains and imprisoned once more in the Denmacho jail, this time facing interrogation from the shogunate itself over ties to a wider conspiracy against Ii Naosuke's regime. His questioners expected him to deny everything or beg for leniency. Instead, Shoin openly confessed the full assassination plot unprompted, believing that stating his convictions plainly might yet move his judges to see the righteousness of his cause. It did not. It gave them everything they needed to condemn him.
On November 21st, 1859, Yoshida Shoin was led from his cell to the execution ground inside Edo's Denmacho prison, and afterward buried at Kozukapara on the city's outskirts. He was 29 years old. Witnesses described him as calm, almost serene, a man who had spent his final weeks in prison writing rather than pleading for his life. The shogunate believed it was silencing a dangerous radical for good. In truth, it was about to learn that ideas, once planted in the right minds, do not die with the man who planted them. In his final days, Shoin wrote a short testament called the Ryukanraku, Record of the Enduring Spirit, addressed to his students
In it, he compared his life to the 4 seasons, insisting that a short life lived with sincerity was no less complete than a long one. He asked his students not to mourn him, but to carry forward the work he had started. The document reached Hagi within weeks of his death. For the young men of Shoka Sonjuku, it read less like a farewell than an instruction.
Shoin's students scattered, some devastated, some radicalized further by his death. Takasugi Shinsaku and Kusaka Genzui, who had once begged their teacher to wait for a better moment, now had nothing left to wait for. The shogunate had made Shoin a martyr for the cause he died pursuing, loyalty to the emperor above obedience to Edo. Within Choshu, and soon across Japan, his execution became a rallying cry rather than a warning. The government had meant to extinguish a threat. Instead, it had lit a fuse.
In 1863, Takasugi Shinsaku formed the Kiheitai, an irregular militia recruiting farmers and townsmen alongside samurai, a radical break from centuries of military tradition that Shoin himself had once argued for. Choshu, once a peripheral domain, became the beating heart of the movement to overthrow the shogunate, fighting the Tokugawa government's own forces, and eventually winning. Every major step of that rebellion carried Shoin's fingerprints, even though he had been dead for years. His students were no longer just remembering their teacher. They were finishing what he had started.
In 1868, the shogunate finally collapsed, and imperial rule was restored under the young Emperor Meiji, the very outcome Shoin had died demanding 9 years earlier. Choshu men, many of them his former students, flooded into the new government that replaced 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule. The revolution Shoin had predicted, planned for, and been executed over had actually happened. He simply was not alive to see it. What came next would prove even his most ambitious students could not have fully imagined.
Itō Hirobumi, once an unremarkable teenager sweeping the floor of Shoka Sonjuku, became Japan's first prime minister in 1885 and the principal author of its first modern constitution. He would serve as prime minister 4 times, shaping the institutions of a country his teacher had never lived to see modernized. When Itō spoke of his education, he did not point to Japan's most prestigious academies. He pointed to one cramped village schoolroom and to 2 brief years under a condemned man.
Yamagata Aritomo, another quiet student from that same schoolroom, went on to build Japan's modern conscript army and served twice as prime minister himself. Beyond these 2 men, Shoin's former students filled the new Meiji government's ministries, military command, and diplomatic corps for decades. Few teachers in Japanese history produced a comparable concentration of founding leadership from so brief and so obscure a school. Shoka Sonjuku operated for barely 2 years. Its influence would shape Japan for the next half-century.
Yoshida Shoin never held office, never led an army,
never lived to see the emperor he died defending hold real power. By every conventional measure of the era, his life ended in total failure. A treason conviction and a public execution at 29. And yet the men he taught for one short year built the government, army, and constitution of modern Japan. He did not live to build the nation. He simply made sure the people who would build it knew why it mattered.
Nearly 8 centuries before Yoshida Shoin was born, another young warrior was already becoming legend on Japan's northern frontier. They called him Hachimantaro, the eldest son of the god of war, a bowman said to fell galloping horsemen with a single arrow. His name was Minamoto no Yoshii, and generations before the samurai would rule Japan in their own name, he was already writing the rules for what a warrior was supposed to be. Next time, we go back to the true origins of the samurai legend.
Yoshida Shoin left behind no army, no title, and no long life. What he left behind was a room in Hagi, where a handful of teenagers learned to believe that Japan's future was theirs to decide, and then went out and decided it. If you found his story as remarkable as we did, subscribe for more true stories from Japan's history. Hit like to support the channel, and tell us in the comments, could 2 years with the right teacher really change the fate of an entire nation?